This film is part of a series in which experts talk about the core concepts in educational assessment and tackle some tricky issues. I'm Stuart Cadwalder, lecturer at the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment. Interpreting assessment outcomes, or assessment literacy as it is known, is a crucial skill set. This is the focus of this film. We are going to hear from assessment specialists from England, Canada, the US and South Africa, each of whom have experience of working with assessment internationally. There's a lot of talk about assessment literacy, and it's important to understand what people mean by the term. Understanding what information we can get and what conclusions can be drawn on the basis of assessment is clearly very important. But dealing with assessment data can be daunting for practitioners, and it can feel like a very technical area. So why does assessment literacy matter? Let's hear from Chris DeLuca, Professor of Educational Assessment at Queen's University, Ontario, Canada. Chris leads the research group there on assessment and evaluation and is the author of a 2015 review of standards and measures of assessment literacy.
So we know that assessment is really one of the fundamental drivers of teaching and learning within classrooms. And we didn't always think that, right? We always thought that pedagogy and instruction led to good learning, and then assessment came in and showed us what the student had learned. And now, how we are positioning it and what we know is that assessment is, in fact, one of those key drivers of learning and one of those pieces of the puzzle that actually inform how a student gets from an initial state of learning to actually achieving the learning goals. And so when teachers are skilled at assessment and thinking creatively about assessment, and where assessment is something that is always part of their professional development, they begin to activate assessment in their classrooms in new and different ways and ways that support student learning. And so when teachers effectively use assessment in their classrooms, their students are more motivated to learn, their students see greater gains in their learning, and ultimately their students begin to leverage assessment themselves to support their own learning. And that's the ultimate goal of assessment for and as learning, is that the students use assessment as a tool to guide their own learning, that they become independent and autonomous learners using the tool of assessment. Assessment also informs instruction. So we've sort of talked a lot about how assessment supports learning, but the teacher also gains some really useful information about how their pedagogy is influencing students' learning and what they need to do differently in their pedagogical approach. But that only works when the assessments are reliable and when they yield valid information. So that comes back to a teacher being skilled at using assessments in effective ways, designing them in effective ways, and drawing important and valid inferences from those assessments. And so we come back to the necessity for teachers to be assessment literate and to be always thinking about improving their skills in the area of assessment. So I think it depends on the context in which a teacher is practicing. So some educational systems rely really heavily on large-scale assessments and external examinations, and others don't. So the context I work in Ontario, while we have a provincial examination system, the outcomes of that examination don't have significant stakes for students or for teachers. They really are just an indicator of cohort achievement and a monitoring of the system performance overall. And so the necessity for a teacher within our system to have some really deep understanding of large-scale assessment, the principles that underpin it, the philosophy of large-scale assessment, is perhaps less important than maybe in another system where large-scale assessment is a dominant mode in which a student maybe navigates their progress throughout a system and maybe their outcomes, both in career and post-secondary. And also in systems where the large-scale assessment impacts teacher performance and teacher pay. In those systems, definitely a teacher needs to have a deeper understanding of how large-scale assessment operates, what are some of the pitfalls, consequences, how do we interpret those large-scale assessment results, how do we prepare students for them, how are we sensitive to the balance between large-scale assessment and classroom assessment. And so the thinking around whether assessment literacy involves large-scale assessment versus classroom assessment or both, indeed it includes both, but the priorities around those will depend, I think, largely on the context of practice that the teacher is operating within. One of the pieces to consider, however, from a field perspective, is that while assessment and even classroom assessment was initiated from the measurement perspective in the psychometric tradition, more recently, classroom assessment has begun to distinguish itself as its own field on distinctive principles, on principles of learning and pedagogy and self-regulation, which are different than how we might position large-scale assessments on psychometric principles. And so understanding some of those fundamental differences lead us to understand how those two assessment traditions operate differently in our classrooms, why they give rise to different purposes and different practices. And that becomes useful for a teacher to understand and be able to then articulate. And I think that that is important because not only does it shape how a student might take it up and how a teacher might take it up in their classroom, but it also helps us shape how the public understands it. And this is a broader function of assessment literacy, is shaping the public psyche and perception of what it means to measure learning and what it means to understand what learning counts. And that's really shaping a public discourse of assessment literacy. And so that in part is the role of the teacher, is to help shape that larger societal narrative on what it means to assess learning.
Chris's 2015 review cited Susan Brookhart's 2011 paper in which she outlined the set of competencies that teachers need in educational assessment. Nowadays, we recognise that assessment affects learning and teaching. As Professor De Lucas just explained, this is the case in the system he's most familiar with, in Canada, where large-scale, high-stakes tests are not such a big feature of schooling. Assessments and how they are used differs a lot from place to place. Next, we hear from Professor Anil Kanji from Tshwane University in Pretoria, South Africa, about how assessment technologies travel around the globe and how they influence educational thinking in South Africa.
So one of the key things that it's important for us in the context of developing nations is to contextualize what we're doing and the value of what we're doing and its impact on our own communities. And without going too much into the theory and what have you, but the whole decolonization debate of knowledge, of education in general, is also now being extended to the areas of assessment in terms of whose information it is, whose data it is, whose knowledge it is, which systems and procedures are we looking, and to what extent that actually works for the communities within we work with. So even the approaches that we use in our work, we first actually tested it to see, does it make sense? Does, for example, theories and approaches that were developed in the West and which are useful, but will it work in our context? And if it does, to what extent? And so in terms of the formative assessment research, we've revised it and adapted the processes that we've learned from northern nations so that it works, and we foreground key aspects from our policies or from our context into these theories or approaches that we get from northern context and adapt it within the context of our schools, our teachers, and our ministry officials. The specific of it, obviously, which will vary, but certainly something that we can share more on. So another issue that really impacts on public understanding of assessment and which has a huge impact, especially in developing nations, is the international exams or international assessments, in particular in most developing nations, the TIM studies, the Pearl studies, in some countries even the PISA studies, because these make huge public headlines. And these results have huge impact on education ministries and their responses to issues of learning and teaching. But in terms of assessment literacy, it is the one time when public get lots of information, lots of attention on issues of assessment, and it certainly impacts on their understanding. And again, these type of assessments push a very strong performativity model where there's comparison between countries and who comes first and who comes last, with very limited engagement on issues of context. And this is where I think academics have a huge role to play in engaging a journalist to be able to understand and report on the nuances, and also engaging publics to sensitize publics on the nuances of this and the values and the value and maybe even limitations of these type of studies, over and above the fact that we, in our case, in many Anglophone countries, exams are very, very dominant, especially end of year exams, and everything revolves around exams. And there should be, I think, moves towards addressing this. Maybe one point I could make that's important is one of the ways of moving away from the dominant of exams or such performativity and accountability systems is how we report results. At the moment, results are reported by percentages, which tell you very, very little in terms of what students know and can do. And if we move to a system where we have more nuanced reporting that reports also outline the knowledges and skills that students or learners demonstrate, and which show parents, for example, that your son or daughter can do X, Y, Z in mathematics, or is able to demonstrate ABC skills in science or languages, I think that will go a long way towards improving the value of assessment and enhance public understanding and use of the assessment results that goes beyond just exams and comparison and percentage scores. Okay. So in terms of assessment literacy, I want to make several arguments. One, I think, is that there's a need for a range of different education role players to have better or to improve their assessment literacy. Besides teachers, besides policymakers, besides ministry officials and parents, I think journalists also need to have a better level of assessment literacy. And so let me first start off with journalists. I think it's the responsibility of assessment specialists and experts to engage with journalists, to talk to journalists on how to report results, on how to present results, and how to ensure that they interpret results that provides a fair and balanced view or an accurate representation of what the data means. So that's the first thing. Policymakers definitely, especially those people who use assessment, and it's literally everybody. The problem is that people just take it for granted, and even senior policymakers have very limited understanding of assessment, which is, again, as I alluded earlier on, it's mainly exams and tests. And so there's definitely a need to improve the knowledge and skills and assessment literacy of policymakers. But again, as I say, it must go beyond policymakers. It must also go to journalists and all stakeholders.
Assessment results are used by a wide range of stakeholders, including teachers, parents, policymakers, politicians, and these groups are also informed by the media. Assessment literacy is important to all of these people so that they don't draw the wrong conclusions from the results. Let's hear from our experts about the kinds of things that do go wrong and the problems that this can cause. First, we hear from Professor Leslie Rakowski from Indiana University in the States.
Where I have seen areas that there are common misunderstanding is, I would say, probably the biggest is that scores are fallible. People take a number and they regard it as truth, as if it's the human body temperature or how tall you are. And there is no understanding that this isn't a direct measure of knowledge and skills and abilities, that it's an indirect measure that is subject to measurement error. And because of that, that there's a standard error around it. When we were giving the assessment literacy workshops, we spent a lot of time around standard error of measurement. And I remember clearly one teacher said, so the scores can be in a band with a minimum possibility and a maximum possibility. And it was really sort of a cliched light bulb moment of realization that a student's score is not an absolute measure, but plausible possibility from a range. In the US, we've sort of oscillated between value-added modeling was really popular in the late 2000s into the 2010s. They were being used in a very heavy-handed way to assess the effectiveness of a teacher. And I was just looking at an article from an economist and some colleagues, Chetty, where they had made the claim that if you remove a teacher with value-added score that was below some threshold, it would contribute to the lifetime earning of their classroom in the amount of $250,000, which I just, face validity. It seemed outrageous to me. And there's been a lot of work that showed, so these value-added scores were being used to sanction teachers, to remove them from the classroom. Oftentimes it would start with remediation, but after a couple of years of value-added scores that didn't meet criteria, they would be removed from the classroom. And later work showed that these value-added scores are really sensitive to the model specification. And a predictor in or out of the regression model could have a value-added score that was bouncing from positive to negative and having really damaging consequences for teachers, for their students, for the schools. And I have a colleague that always makes the comment that there isn't a bench, like a sports analogy, there isn't a bench of teachers that are just waiting to step up, or a next line of teachers just waiting to step into the classroom. So when you start removing teachers without anyone that can come to replace them, it has a whole cascading effect. So not just from a technical perspective, but from an everyday classroom perspective, these kinds of results that were coming from test scores were really causing a lot of trouble. Another funny, sort of perverse result, when No Child Left Behind was enacted in 2002 or early 2000s, there was a expectation of annual yearly progress in a school. And if they did not make annual yearly progress, then there were sanctions. And they got progressively worse. A high-performing school had often hit the ceiling. There was very little room to grow. And so annual yearly progress wasn't being met in some of the best schools in the country because they were already doing a great job. So yeah, again, one of the sorts of perversions and a general lack of assessment literacy in those contexts leaves the school districts, the school leaders, the teachers, again, just like a little boat on a big ocean, just being tossed around.
It relates to the understanding that assessment is much, much broader than tests and exams. It goes beyond. It extends to also any learning and teaching activity within a schooling context or university context that can be used to provide evidence of what students or learners understand and what teachers need to do or can do to better improve learning. So that misconception has to be addressed. I think another misconception is that assessment is primarily for selection purposes. And if it's more than selection, there's very limited understanding of how it can be used for policy purposes or for improving learning or for improving teaching as well. Teachers get that. Teachers understand that. But I think there's very limited expertise and knowledge on how they can do it and how they can use it to improve their own teaching, to improve their own use of the data for learning. And maybe lastly, I think a huge misconception, and I think that will make a big difference, is the fact that assessment information or even test and exam information cannot be shared with learners. And for me, that will make a big difference if we realize that assessment information is first and foremost about getting evidence, and that the evidence must and should be shared with learners and students, because it is their learning that we focus on, it is their improvement, it is their progress. And I think if we can get that right, especially amongst academics and teachers, it will make a big difference. I think one of the other things people have misconceptions or get wrong is that assessments are also highly equated to high-stakes standardized testing, which may be in exams. But related to that is the misconception that higher scores or better performance means higher levels of intelligence, or even sometimes means better learning, rather than actually what students or learners actually understand, or areas of improvement that the data or the information is telling us. So certainly that's the one big issue. Then another key misconception is that the limited understanding of what formative assessment constitutes or how diagnostic assessments should be used. Certainly within parents or communities, there's very limited understanding of formative and diagnostic. And there's certainly also limited understanding amongst, I would say, teachers and academics about formative assessment. In most cases, there's a misconception that formative assessment means continuously using more summative tests. And it is not used for the sole purpose of improving learning and or improving teaching. And again, allude to the point is missing in this whole conception is that learners or the students should not be involved in the whole assessment process.
The consequences of misinterpreting assessment can be enormous for individuals and for countries' assessment policies. And as we have heard, various things can go wrong. The context matters, since the curriculum and education systems differ across countries, sectors of education, and even across organisations. As well as this, the purpose of the assessment varies. Assessment literacy is not the same as numeracy. Next, we hear from Daisy Christodoulou from the company No More Marking Limited. This is about the context of teacher assessment literacy in England. And then we return to our other experts for their views about how to improve assessment literacy.
I think that teachers need to understand assessment in the way that's going to make most use for them in their classroom. So I do think that perhaps the most important aspect of assessment for teachers to understand is formative assessment. So formative assessment is the aspect of assessment that I would define as dealing with the next steps. So how, as a teacher, you work out where are my students at the minute, and what do they need next? What do I need to teach them next? Where are their weaknesses? What do they need to do to improve? So I think that's very important. And I think that's the aspect of assessment that most teachers probably are familiar with and are good with. But I think it is also important for teachers to know about summative assessment, because if they don't understand some of the technical aspects of summative assessment, I think it can lead to confusion and it can lead to some problems. And I define summative assessment as being more about trying to get a shared meaning about a student's attainment that holds true across many different contexts, not just in the teacher's classroom. And I think the big difference between formative and summative assessment, and the important thing that I think is important for teachers to understand, is that formative assessment is something that teachers can and should have a lot of control over, and there is a lot of flexibility, and it is something that really is their responsibility. But summative assessment, because you're trying to get a shared meaning, and you're trying to work out where a student is relative to a kind of wider national picture, that's something that a teacher can't do on their own, even the most skilled teacher in the world, who's got the most experience. It needs something external. And it does need probably a bit of an understanding of some kind of technical aspects of assessment. And I think it is important for teachers to have some grasp of that, because otherwise, as I say, it leads to confusion, leads to problems. And one big problem is that when you're setting a formative assessment, often you want students to get most of the questions right, and you would expect them to get most of them right. Actually, when it comes to summative assessment, a lot of those assessments are designed such that about half of the students, maybe the median score will be 50%. And so you'll have half the students getting below half marks. And that can feel a bit wrong. And if you were setting a formative assessment, it would be. But when it comes to a summative assessment, you need that. You're trying to set an assessment to give you a range, to give you an idea of the spread of attainment. So I think there's some technical aspects of summative assessment that it is important for teachers to know, otherwise you can get confusion. I think that most teachers in England, I think there's some aspects of assessment that are very well understood. I think there are other aspects which are less well understood. And I think probably the aspects that are less well understood are those that are a bit more technical, that perhaps do have bits to do with summative assessment and some of the mechanics of sort of setting grades and what have you. If there's one aspect of assessment I'd say is not particularly well understood, and I can understand why, because there's aspects of the system which don't help with it. It's probably the way that grades are set, or what a grade is. So I think that a lot of teachers maybe I think that students do come pre-packaged into grades, and that the grades are a discrete, a kind of discrete category. So if that's a grade 9, or whether it's a kind of working towards, or any kind of grade, that it's somehow qualitatively different from the other grades. And in reality, that's not the case. In reality, there's a distribution of achievement, and the grades are lines on that distribution. So student attainment is continuous. It doesn't have these kind of discrete breaks. And I think that's poorly understood. And I think that's poorly understood, and it's one of those things that's poorly understood and leads to real problems. So it isn't just a kind of esoteric technical point. It means that you can have two students who are really similar in attainment, but because they fall either side of a grade boundary, one ends up with a very different set of interventions or classroom practices than the other student, even though they're effectively at the same standard. So that's a really good example of how an understanding of assessment has quite big pedagogical consequences. I think if you want to improve teachers' assessment literacy, I think the difficult thing is, I think there's aspects of teachers' assessment literacy, if you want to improve it, has to happen in teacher training. And if it isn't happening in teacher training, then it's often quite hard to come in and do things when teachers are busy and they're teaching and they've got all kinds of other things going on. But I think there is a bit of an appetite, particularly from sort of senior managers who get promoted to a role in assessment. And there's obviously lots of ways you can do things involving kind of remote learning now. So yeah, I think the ways you could improve it for me, you could be running some online content, online courses, and the aspects I'd focus on the most would probably be some of those technical aspects, the basics around summative assessment, some of the basics around assessment reliability, what a grade is, how standards are set nationally. I think those things are things that certainly lots of senior leaders in schools would be interested in, and that do have a direct impact on how things work in schools. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think assessment should be a priority for teacher training, and there's obviously a lot of things that trainee teachers need to learn, and it's always going to be competing content that you need to have on the trainee teacher curriculum. But my argument would be assessment is a high priority for a couple of reasons. The first reason is there's a lot of aspects of assessment that would be valuable to teach that are actually relatively straightforward to teach, that you don't have to be practicing in a classroom to teach. You could do it quite simply. There's some sort of key content that you could teach the trainees. So it's relatively straightforward. And why I think it's particularly valuable is, as I've said, if you don't get that basic understanding of some of the basic concepts, it causes so many problems further down the line. And as I say, not just sort of arcane issues here that I'm talking about, but genuine issues around how students end up in the wrong classes, how students end up, the teachers getting a misunderstanding of actually what their standard is, all kinds of real life issues that it can cause. So I think it is a priority.
So there are two key areas that I think could be improved. And I'm speaking about the context of the US because it's the one I know the most closely. Internationally, maybe there is a different set of tools or different opportunities for teachers. But in Indiana, for instance, the curriculum for pre-service teachers is very fixed, with almost no room for any sort of elective courses, and there is no class on assessment per se, where they learn about testing in the classroom, where they learn about standard error of measure, where they learn about any of these kinds of things. So when they leave with their degree and they go into the classroom, they haven't had an opportunity to build up those skills. And there is also very little in terms of professional development opportunities for teachers to learn assessment literacy skills. So that they can go their entire career without having not just not having the skills, but not having had the opportunity to develop those skills in any meaningful way. And what they might have has been gleaned from years in the classroom and from the district test coordinator who shares some information, but no systematic or formal kind of training in this area. And those are two things that I think could really do a lot to improve, and just expressing the importance of understanding it, in those sort of systematic training opportunities, I think would go a long way.
So I think one of the ways that we can really help improve assessment literacies of education stakeholders, especially teachers, school leaders or school managers and or ministry officials, is that we need capacity development programs that not only allow them to acquire new knowledge and skills, but also to apply it to the specific context that they're working on at the time which they're learning, but more important, that is integrated into their work. That the capacity development shouldn't be add-on. So one of the models that we use, and quite successfully, especially with teachers and ministry officials, is that we have what's called a REMAPS model, which is a model that's based on reflection, mediation, acquisition of new knowledge and skills, and support, as well as implementation. And the model is that you, one, work with teachers or ministry officials in the workshop. They then go back and implement the new knowledge and skills in their own setting. And the workshop content is integrated into the work. So, for example, for teachers, we actually work with them during the workshop on the next lesson that they would be teaching. Or for ministry officials, we work with them on identifying a problem or project that they're working with in their department on how, say, to use assessment data, which then they will go back and work on. And they come back to the workshop to report on progress, to identify whether it has worked, whether it hasn't worked, what they have changed, what needs to be revised, and share this information with the rest of their colleagues. And the last part of the model is the support component, which we argue and require the development of both teacher learning communities, or at the district level, district learning communities, or at the ministry level of ministry officials learning communities, that work with each other to support each other and serve as the first point of contact if there's any need for information or support. And then we as facilitators or academics or scholars will be available to support this process. And we know it worked because we did a RCT with teachers that showed significant differences between those who participated and did not participate. And now we're extending this to district officials and assessment literacy with ministry officials.
Assessment literacy is of course a complex issue because it depends on the purpose of assessments and how they relate to the wider education system of which they are part. Assessment literacy also relates to people's core beliefs about how they think people learn, can be assessed, and what the scores mean about the humans who take the assessments and their learning. We saw too that assessment can effectively shape teaching and learning. In fact, assessment policy is often made to drive changes to teaching and learning in classrooms. But without due attention to the professional development of teachers as part of assessment reforms, the changed policies might not have the desired effects. So assessment literacy is important in this regard too. We hope that you found this video interesting. If you'd like to watch more of our films on assessment topics, you can find them on the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment website. The link is here.